And
all right.
I'm recording.
And then we do some dumb things.
I'm gonna roll slate.
Do I look like I'm dead? I feel like I'm dead.
Yeah.
Everything's fine.
A lot of Gloomhaven lately.
I'm alive. Everything's fine.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Untitled Podcast. This is episode 17.
Are you sure?
It is. 16 was live. If you didn't catch it live, it'll be up on YouTube at some point.
Worst intro ever.
I think we've had worse. But we are going to have a special guest today. So we're going to zip through the wick this week in Kickstarter. And we're just going to talk about one thing, and that is Birds of Paradise. They are bird-themed dice. And they are launching a Kickstarter on October 15th for, I think, like 6 or 8 sets of dice. They're amazing. We have prototypes of them around here somewhere, and we've been using them.
They roll well. Let's put it this way.
Well,
Ezra tortures us constantly with his Birds of Paradise.
Yes. So, I mean, they roll like dice, but the percentiles tend to roll really low. So if you're playing D&D, you don't want to use those. But for playing Cthulhu, they are the perfect dice. In fact, we unofficially claim them as our official Call of Cthulhu dice.
Officially?
Yes.
Unofficially. Okay.
So that is October 15th. We'll be sending out links and promoting it like crazy.
Yep.
But that's it for the wick. That's all we're doing.
So who else do we know who has a Kickstarter coming up?
We know. Why don't you introduce our guest?
No, you can.
All right. We are really excited to bring Brett Schofield into the Untitled Podcast. How are you doing, Brett?
I'm good. Thank you so much for having me today.
It feels weird because I just want to play Call of Cthulhu with you.
It's been a long time since we've had an opportunity to actually see each other, so this is a delightful chance to do a little digital reunion.
Yep.
Yeah, exactly.
Yep, it's awesome. Good to see you.
So before we jump into the Librarians, which you are the designer of,
what?
Brett was in our Call of Cthulhu home game, and it was a lot of fun.
It was crazy. Let's put it this way. I learned a lot of crazy tricks.
So much so that I was playing. I was playing Jackson Elias, not as Jackson Elias because I didn't know he was from Brooklyn. But he had a weighted cane because it was such a great weapon that your character had, and people still comment like, "Oh, that's such a great idea." I'm like, "Yes, that was all mine."
Man about town, yet personal defense weapon.
Yes.
I'm pretty sure for that campaign we needed to roll our stats, and so I rolled really high agility and body, and then medium to low everything else. And so I came up with this idea of a like second story man who, after stealing enough money, kind of went soft, got fat, dressed in really nice clothes, tried to live the lifestyle of a gentleman that he had always wanted to. He just never had the finances to be able to do it. So yeah, you kind of got the washed up thief.
But still had the skills to like tranquilize dogs using meat by throwing it over the fence, like those classic tropes.
The tropes.
I mean, back in the day, you probably would have tried doing something more traditional, but at that point in time, he was, more interested in not really doing much for results. So to advance the campaign or for anybody else. I mean, if you throw enough money at a problem, it goes away, right?
Yeah, it becomes somebody else's problem. It's exactly how it works.
Yeah, that's having a job. That is a job. So
there's no transition to the Librarians.
Well, there is, because I know you as a member of our Call of Cthulhu game, and then suddenly I see this post pop up that you have designed not only designed a board game, but designed a board game with an IP that I know. So I think I would love to just kind of talk about that process of when you decided you wanted to make a game, and what was the process that you started with, I guess.
Sure. So I'll say that I think there's actually a lot of connections between those, Call of Cthulhu role-playing games and the current Librarians Adventure Card Game. That it's very story-driven. You really get to kind of go through and play different missions. So what I always look for in my board games are story elements and narrative elements, and I think that those pull through here. So that's kind of the through line from the RPGs of the of the past and this game. But to actually answer your question, a lot of it was driven by moving to Nebraska, where I currently live. So moving away from a lot of the gaming groups that I had been associated with, starting a new job, and so having just not a lot of time to find new gaming groups. And you know how important having the right gaming group is to having a good gaming experience. And so ultimately, kind of that sense of loneliness drove me kind of back into designing games that I had done before, but never really seriously. I think everybody who designs games, tries their own role-playing system at some point, seriously or not seriously, or they make home rules for, let's play Dungeons and Dragons, but I don't like the way armor class works, so let's insert this new system. Or people who like card games often will make their own magic cards, little things like that. And I kind of asked, could I do this more seriously? And so started scribbling on 3x5 cards, and began making a game that was no fun to play for the first couple of months. Honestly, it was pretty painful to get through those first prototypes. So
how long did it take you from like, I'm going to make a game to your first prototype? Like what was, can we dive into that a little bit when you're like, so tell us a little bit about like what was the approach when you're like scribbling on 3x5 cards? What were on them? Were you laying them out? Like, how did that work?
So the number one piece of advice that experienced designers, which I am not, but actual experienced designers give to new designers is get your first prototype done as quickly as possible. It doesn't have to be the whole game. It shouldn't be the whole game. It should just be enough to test one little piece of it. Because the systems that make so much sense in your head and you think are going to be beautiful and going to be the next, Gloomhaven, probably suck when you get them to the table. So for me, I think it was maybe 2 weeks before I had something on the table and found out how bad it played. Okay. But it's one little, it's the seed point of a game. It's not the whole game.
So was that one thing that you got on the table, was that like sort of like the beginning mechanic? Was that what you felt was like okay, so it was kind of like the starting point, and was your process then, let's start and test, then let's build and test, then let's build and test? Was that?
Yeah, plenty of iteration. Every time you play something, you're trying to identify basically where the fun is in your game, and how can you take that little tiny nugget of fun that is surrounded by lots of not fun, right, for an early prototype, and how can you get rid of all the not fun elements, and how can you focus players on what is fun?
Yeah. So when you say not fun, like give us an example, you know what I mean? Because to me, there's even in some games, I'm like, this is not fun. Mostly losing, but.
Well, so unfortunately, fun is subjective, right? As much as we would like a universal truth for it. So it's what's not fun to you, the designer, or maybe to the people you're testing with. And that doesn't mean it's going to resonate perfectly with everybody. But great examples. So in my game, you do these skill checks. And at one point in time, the skill checks were entirely deterministic. Like there was no randomization to it. You would just be successful or not successful. And so that robs the game of tension. Like, why do it if there's no risk of failure? Okay. So like, role-playing games, for instance, have you roll dice to determine if it's going to be successful. Or you have an investigative game like Gumshoe that doesn't really care about the tension of, are you successful? They care about the tension of, do you find the pieces to put together the puzzle? And so they just give you the information, but that's because the focus is on something different.
So I do have a question about, because this is a story-based game, how early did you start developing the storyline to go with the mechanics, which ultimately later on, I'm assuming, was set aside?
Yeah, so The Librarians license is well, when I say relatively new to the game, I mean it came in about 2 years ago. And before that, there was maybe 2 years of work on the game. So about halfway through the game's lifespan, the Librarians license came in. So before that, it was a story from another intellectual property. So it was just a story that I thought was interesting with characters that I liked. And what I wanted to do is create a system that would be flexible enough to tell lots of different stories. And so ultimately, when I was looking for a publisher for this, I tried to say, look, this game will let you tell the stories you want to tell. And here's an example story with example characters that I've told. But it wasn't a story that I came up with on my own.
Gotcha. Okay. And I'm assuming that helped you avoid the writer's block of trying to come up with a story. You just, and you knew, and everybody knew that it was just a sample story. That's actually really smart.
So, I think every creative goes to different places for their creativity. And for me, it was too overwhelming to try and do the creative side of like world building and all of that and the mechanics, particularly since I knew that any world building I put into it may well not make it into the final product, right? Like if I had spent a lot of time crafting my perfect sci-fi setting, that time would have all been wasted.
And so where did you kind of get the experience to do this? Because again, talking to you, even though this is your first published game, you know what I mean? You sound like, and again, this might be just in hindsight, but you sound like there's some experience there, just knowing the fact that, most people, if they're making their first game, may not know that, somebody who picks it up to publish it may say, we don't like the story, that's got to go. We're going to do this instead, and you didn't sound like you ever had the idea that world building was a piece of it and would be heartbroken if it was gone. So did you have experience before that, just knowing that that's a potential, like how this actual process works?
Sure. I was going to say hindsight is 20/20, but that seems to mean something different with this year. But anyway, so I'm an academic by trade. And so anytime I'm interested in anything, I'm going to dive in to, I was going to say the literature, but obviously that means something different in academia than it does in other realms of life. But I tried to go in and say, what have experienced game designers written or recorded or made videos about? Because they've already made all these mistakes, and it sure would be nice if I didn't have to go make them myself. So the early on process was about making those prototypes and iterating the prototypes and trying to learn as much as possible. So, the car ride back and forth from work, you got a podcast playlist of really good game designers telling you about dumb rookie mistakes that they made so that I didn't have to make them.
What are some of those resources? I know that, we listen to Ludology, but what are some of those other resources that you used?
So that's a really fantastic source. There's the Board Game Design Lab podcast, which is somewhat recently joined the Dice Tower Network as another one. And there's a number of podcasts that kind of get started. People are interested in doing them for a time and then they kind of die off. So there's like Game Designers of North Carolina that I think they just had some people in North Carolina that wanted to do this podcast. They did, 2 dozen episodes and then kind of lost steam on it. But really anybody else's experiences of what they had to do to make a game successful. So, potentially even this episode of your podcast, and I'm sure previous episodes where you've spoken with game designers.
Yeah. One of the interesting things is we spoke to Brandon Ross of Bard Games, and they're kickstarting a game right now called Tater Freighter, which was a little card game. His games are 15 minutes, 20 minutes, fun, and they got the game and they went and they were trying to find the right IP for it, and all of the playthroughs, it ended up being like, no, people really just like the the world that was built of potatoes or whatever it was, you know? So I think that's an interesting dichotomy of a designer who didn't want to give up that and ended up being successful. Because I'm sure most people are like, it's going to sell well, you know, way better if we put Marvel behind it. So,
you know, I find success is so often the secret sauce of the right creative minds and the right circumstances. So, you know, there's things that I did that would not be best practices, but they ended up working out for me, or at least so far. And I'm sure that every designer's got some little circumstance like that.
Okay. So once you had a game, so you said like 2 years of development, and then the Librarians came on board. How did the Librarians come on board? What was that process?
Yeah, so eventually, once you feel like the game is in a state where you could imagine it being published, and I should say that takes a tremendous amount of external playtesting. So by the time I was, sorry,
I'm like, how many people, like, is your wife sick of your game at this point? Like 2 years ago, was she like, please get out of the house, please don't ever mention it again? Like, you know, how many people play tested for you? Like, how rigorous was it where you're like, we're going to play it again this week? And she's like, oh, get away from me.
Yeah, let's talk about that, and then let's get to your question. So
Sorry.
no, playtesting is such a critical element of it. And, you know, once again, I'm an academic, I'm a scientist. What I want is data. So I took this game to a variety of like local game conventions to demo it and to get feedback from people I didn't know, because you almost can't trust the people you know. Right? They have this pre-existing friendship with you, and maybe they don't want to insult you by telling you your game is rubbish, excuse me, or whatever. So you got to find people you don't know to tell you how bad your game is. And I'll mention that playtesters are really good at identifying problems and really bad at coming up with solutions.
Yeah.
So a playtester will be like, oh, you should do XYZ. And XYZ might actually make the game a lot worse. And the question is, well, why do you think that would make it better? What problem have you identified that I can rectify? Because that's my job as the designer. And you know, playtesters have sometimes suggested solutions to me that I've adopted, but there have been a lot more solutions that I have not adopted.
Was the question, was it sort of an open-ended question type thing, or did you have in the back of your mind when you play tested, you're like, these are the 5 questions I want to ask, or I've learned these things at this point, next time, these are the next 5 questions I want to ask? Like, what was your approach when you're talking to your play testers?
It's a really good question. I think there's actually kind of 2 schools of thought on that. I think that most designers have very specific questions in mind. They want to test very narrow, specific things. For me, I was coming in without that experience. And yes, I had read about, you know, these questions to ask, but I felt like I needed more general questions like, did you even have fun? Like, would you be willing to do this again, or are you looking for the nearest exit? And so I tended to ask much more open questions, and then add some little element of specificity to them, like a suggestion by another game designer was asking, like, how could you make, or what could be done to make this game even just 5% better? As in that little incremental, like, what's the next step? As opposed to the more broad question of just, how could this game be better? But to answer your question about how many people, by the time I actually pitched it to companies, I had over 200 playtests that did not involve me and did not involve my core playtest team. These are all strangers playtesting it and recording data from that. So massive spreadsheets listing like which story they played, whether they were successful or not, comments that came out of it, that kind of stuff.
Did that also, do you think, taint some of their experience if they were successful or not? Just looking across at the data saying, well, you know, these criteria fall to this kinds of answers, these criteria fall into that. Because once again, you get very analytical. You can now look at trends, and the more data you have, the easier it is to sort of pick things out. So what was that experience like, and what were the things that you were finding?
Particularly for a cooperative game, which the Librarians is, loss is going to be something that just happens. And so you want loss to be fun. Because if a cooperative game, you just sit down and you win every time, at least personally, I get very bored of it quickly.
Yep.
You know, I'll enjoy my first 3 or 4 plays, like, oh, isn't this enjoyable? And then you realize that there's no real tension there, and you stop playing. So for me, I wasn't so much concerned about, you know, if you won, you liked it, and if you lost, you didn't like it, because I want loss to feel good. Like you accomplished something, or you were tantalizingly close to victory, you want to try it again.
Yep. Yeah.
So I think in a competitive game, that might be a lot more important, where one person's going to win and everybody else by default's going to lose.
So what was the process of taking then that game and pitching it? Where did you do it? How did you do that?
Yeah. So once you have all that play testing, once you're ready for that, you kind of have 2 options. You can either go down the role of self-publishing, which means that you're going to transition from game designer to publisher and developer and art director and marketing team and all of that stuff. And I knew that I desperately did not want to do those things. So the other option is that you go to pre-existing companies and you pitch the game. And you have to get accustomed to rejection, because there are a lot of games out there and a lot of really fantastic games. And there's only so many publishers. Even in the days of Kickstarter, there's only so many publishers, and they can only publish so much. So most games that get pitched are not going to get picked up by a publisher.
Oh, I was going to ask you, when you were in that prepping phase, you know, can we dig into that a little bit more? Because, you know, again, you're right. And not only that too, I was going to bring up, not every publisher is for your game, if that makes sense. They're not, you know, so how did you research that? And then when you're like, I need to make a pitch, what is it? Are you doing a one sheet with basic facts? Like, what was your prep there?
Yeah, so you bring up a next really important point, and a point that I think a lot of first-time designers overlook, in that you don't want to send your game to every publisher. You want to try to narrow down which publishers might actually like my game. So I tried to identify publishers that had worked with intellectual property before, right? Because I had already designed the game off a piece of intellectual property, so maybe it could keep that property, or maybe they were like, they could say this game would be perfect for a property that we already have, which is how the Librarians came about. And I also looked for publishers that did cooperative games, and cooperative games that have a strong narrative component to them. So, you know, something like Pandemic, you can kind of weave a story by the player's actions, but there's not much of a story to the base Pandemic. It's kind of the beauty of the Pandemic legacy system, is that it weaves a story into what's otherwise a relatively story-free game. As awesome as that game is, I love Pandemic. So yeah, those were kind of my criteria. And some of that is just looking at your game shelf and being like, okay, what games are similar to mine and who published them? But there's also lists of publishers online, and whether they want pitches, because some don't. Some want to do it all in-house. And what sort of games they're looking for, and things like that. I can actually, I don't remember off the top of my head, but I can get you a URL afterwards if you're interested in some of these lists of publishers.
Yeah, that would be cool. Because not only that too, I just like to look at what other games are out there. You know what I mean? You're like, who published all this? Especially when we talk to people who publish game, a designer, then we look at all the other stuff that the publishers made, and you're like, oh, you're just like, ching, 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 money's gone.
I was going to say, honestly, the publishers like this too, because they don't want their time wasted by, you know, if they're a cooperative game manufacturer and somebody is pitching them the next Magic the Gathering, right? They don't want that. They're just wasting their time.
So when you prepped for your meeting, I mean, did you just literally cold call? Did you send an email? Like, what was that? What was your pitch? Like, how did you A, get in the door to have a conversation? And then B, once you got somebody to say, yeah, I've got 20 minutes for you, what did you do in those 20 minutes?
Yeah, so the first thing that has to be noted is this, what I did was all pre-pandemic days. So
yeah.
These days, I'm guessing it's a little different. There's probably a lot more digital pitch meetings.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But in a pre-pandemic world, if we can imagine such a thing, pitches were all done in person, or 95% of them were done in person, and the biggest concentration of publishers and designers are going to be big gaming conventions. So I went to Origins, and this was my first big gaming convention, and I knew I was going specifically to pitch the game to companies.
Okay, so you had pre-scheduled meetings with them, just like any other normal, because a lot of us think about conventions not as a business place or a business opportunity to meet people and talk to other businesses, but like before, conventions were like, what games am I going to play?
So I went in, my whole time there, I did True Dungeon once, which I strongly suggest to anybody who's never been to one of these conventions before. It's a neat experience, but that was the only time I spent doing gaming for me. Otherwise, I was there for business, I guess.
Okay.
So first of all, reach out to publishers ahead of time. Many of them will set up a meeting with you, assuming they like what your initial pitch is, and we'll get to what's in that initial pitch in a second. But also I found a lot of like spur of the moment meetings. So you'd wander up to a booth that's not currently being mobbed by people, right? The beauty of Origins is that there's actually times when the convention gets calmer. My understanding is Gen Con's just madness the whole time, that people at the booths never have a spare moment. They're just going at full speed the whole time. But I would wander up to a booth that nobody was at, and I knew that was a company that I could be interested in or might be interested in my game, and they'd say, oh yeah, let's sit down now, or why don't you come back in an hour, let's have a quick meeting. So what I sent, so basically I cold called people via email, and what was in there was like a 1-paragraph distillation of like what makes your game awesome and why that publisher might like it. And it can't be just a fill in the blank, your company might like this game because reason, right? It has to actually be well crafted and well tailored to that company. And then, like I said, a short, this is why this game is special and worth taking a look at. And that is then followed with a 1-page PDF that is what gets called your sell sheet, which is a 1-page version of why your game is awesome and why a general publisher might like it.
Okay. So in all of that stuff, do you ever put mechanics or any like I don't know, just, you know what I mean? Like thoughts and feelings, like, you know what I mean? So I can only relate this to like movies or pitching, concepts for television shows, and the fact that you want to give the publisher like the feel of the game, or, you know what I mean? Is that like, give me some of those words.
It's
like
Jaws meets Star Trek.
Okay. Let's not.
So my understanding is that is kind of a rare example of something that works well in film and TV pitching and doesn't work so well in board games. But otherwise, my understanding is that there's a lot of similarities between pitching your TV show and pitching a game, in that you want to hit the major selling points. Like, why will people watch this TV show? Or there, it's probably more about story setting, characters, atmosphere. Or a game, it's probably going to be a mixture of those and mechanics. And not that you are diving into all the details of your mechanic, right? That's going to go on and on forever. But places where players get a chance to make meaningful decisions that will be exciting and interesting to them. Something along those lines.
Would you be able to give us that short pitch of what the Librarians is before and before the Librarians are attached?
Sure. Oh, before the Librarians are attached. So yes, I can. But you have to keep in mind that the last time I gave this was 2.5 years ago.
Yeah.
But the notion for this game. Oh, and the other thing you have to be aware of is I'm an academic and therefore extremely long-winded, as I'm here at this point.
Yeah, our screenwriter teacher wanted to get our log lines. That like, what's it about?
Yeah,
why you care. 27 words or less.
That
was our goal.
For me to do that. For me to do that, I have to write and then carefully edit down, I'm starting at half a page and editing down to one sentence.
No, but that is also the process, even in screenwriting and like other movie pitches, is the fact that you start with this big jumbly concept and you're like, let me just distill this down to the bullet points that people care about.
Yeah. So for Librarians, the idea is that it's an episodic storytelling game. You get to play through different stories each time you sit down. And you are playing with characters who are working together cooperatively, a couple of ways that you can actually help each other progress the mission. And you constantly have to weigh whether you're going to drive forward the mission and complete the story, or whether you're going to be addressing all of these obstacles that stand in your way and are actually helping your antagonists to win. So that would be my super short. In an ideal world, maybe I would have talked a little bit about one or two neat mechanics in there, but I think that would be kind of as long as you would want to go.
So in that sort of pitch, you didn't reference that it was a card game. Is that?
Ooh. That probably would have been an important thing.
I love Thomas. Well, I'm sure it's like when you're writing, it's like cooperative card game. You're now looking at adjectives to be descriptive. Adjectives and adverbs in order to like also emote feeling and understanding of what the game would be like to play, as opposed to.
I realized I was behind the wheel of a bus driving towards you, but
no, it's a great question, right? So yes, I think you do want to talk a little bit about the basic form that your game comes in. A pure card game is going to drive some publishers away. But is also going to attract other publishers because cards are easy to produce.
Yep. And box and ship and do all those other small things that are expensive.
Kickstarter coming soon.
They're heavy. They're very heavy. So shipping is a pain in the butt. But as far as production goes, boards and things like that are far more likely to get damaged and all that kind of stuff.
So is there a board with this game, or is it all card based?
It's all card based
type of thing.
Yeah, there is an optional mat that is being designed right now, but honestly, it's just there for theme. It's just a neat picture that you can be playing on, kind of like you might do if you were playing any other card game. So yeah, it's just cards. Well, sorry, I should say just cards, and there are dice that are involved in resolving actions, but there's no board.
Okay, so in the process, you have met with people and pitched them. Do you actually bring something with you? I'm assuming you bring a prototype. Have you made a prototype at this point for Origins?
Absolutely. So what I went in with is 3 prototypes that were fully made and I felt like could go out to somebody. And what, if you have a publisher who, well, I guess I should say the meeting's going to happen first, right? You schedule a meeting, you sit down with that publisher. I am told that experienced designers might get an hour to play through a little bit of the game with somebody. As somebody with no track record, I never got to play the game with people. What I got to do is kind of pull out some cards and, pull out some, the dice and try to explain in 10 minutes or less why the game was special. So those were always in-person meetings. As I mentioned, I think now there's going to be a lot of Zoom sort of pitches. But, you've got 10 minutes to convince this person that the game is worth looking at more. And that looking at more is you hand them a copy of your prototype.
Got it.
Gotcha.
When you do so, you have to kind of check in with them about the conditions that they're taking the prototype under. As in, some companies want to exclusively, like, be the only company that is looking at the game. As in, we're going to take it, we're really interested, we think we're going to publish this, but we want to double check, so we don't want you giving the prototype to other companies. In my situation, they all said, look, we're interested enough to give it a shot, but we're not like planting our flag. So feel free to give this to others. But I think it's good to have that communication of, are you comfortable with me showing this to other companies or not?
And so you said you made 3 or 4 copies, so then they obviously give them back when they're done, or did they not? So
not necessarily. To me, that was pretty variable. So 3 copies went out. I received 1 back. So the understanding is that when you give a prototype to a company, they might send it back to you, but might not. A lot of these companies have little, maybe like a really short contract that you sign that you're not like giving away any of the rights to the game or something like that, but you might be saying that you're okay with them doing, disposing of the prototype or whatever.
Gotcha. Okay.
So I had a very variable experience with that, and honestly, part of it was how good the publisher was.
So with so were any of those like the speed dating scenarios that they set up, or was it all meetings that you schedule ahead of time?
For me, it was all meetings I scheduled ahead of time. The speed dating that they put together, I think is a neat opportunity, but they will create this and post on Facebook that, hey, we've just opened this up, and 5 minutes later, all of the designer slots are filled. And as somebody who's not a big fan of Facebook and doesn't check it frequently, I would find out, the next day.
Right.
So that's something I've never done, partially just because they fill so quickly. The other thing is I've heard mixed things from designers about how useful it is. As a publisher, you are trying to absorb like a dozen different pitches, and that's starting to put too many apples into too small of a sack. Right? It's hard to actually keep track of all of that. And then as a designer, it's like, it's like normal speed dating, right? You've got 30 seconds to tell me why you're an interesting human being. And maybe it's just that I'm so long-winded, I can't do that in 30 seconds.
Yeah, I think mine would be too weird, and if you didn't get it right away, I'd be like, whatever.
So you made 3 prototypes,
and then you probably made 3 more.
You ended up with Everything Epic Games. So how did that process go?
Pitched to a variety of companies at Origins. Had a number of companies that were interested. The other thing is that I had put the prototype on Tabletop Simulator. So there were a couple of companies that said, look, we'd love to give this a try, but we're not going to have space in our luggage. Like, we've got so much other stuff we've got to take home. We're just not going to have space. Could you mail it to us afterwards? And I'd say, yes, but if you want, it's also on Tabletop Simulator, right? I can give you access to it digitally. And some publishers really liked that, and others said, no, we want to play with a physical prototype, which is reasonable, right? Tabletop Simulator is a very different sort of thing than the tabletop.
Right.
Well, and not only that, if they're going to invest in something that they're going to have to make, they want to see what really shows up at the door.
Well, sorry, let me answer your question first, and then we'll talk about like what the prototype looked like. What are publishers expecting from a prototype?
Yeah.
So anyways, Everything Epic was one of these companies that looked at the Tabletop Simulator mod, really liked the game, reached out to me and said, we already have secured the rights to this license, the Librarians, and we feel like this game and the IP really nicely tie together. How would you feel about adapting this game to a totally different intellectual property?
Mhm.
So to back up and talk about prototypes for a second.
Yeah.
Different designers have different thoughts about what the prototype needs to look like. But in general, the advice is to make it simple. Don't invest any money in art or in graphic design. All you need is something that's going to look clean. You don't need something that looks professional.
Mm-hmm.
So my question was always, is the graphic design standing in the way of gameplay? And if it's not, then it's good enough. So there's lots of icons available for free online. Go grab those. You can grab free art online, or if you're working with intellectual property, like screen grabs or things like that. And the cards were just a sleeve, a random game card inside, and a printed piece of paper in front of that.
Okay.
And then the dice were the cheapest dice I could find on Amazon. And then I printed out a sticker sheet with the icons and affixed. Spent a couple of days carefully cutting and affixing stickers onto dice. And it works shockingly well.
Yeah.
As long as you're willing to put that kind of time and craftiness into it.
Nice. All right. That sounds good. So did you have any artwork in it? I mean, and by artwork, I mean, did you have any, so the images of that IP, like characters and whatnot, were those on the cards?
Yes. So like I said, the game was developed with a different intellectual property. And yeah, I went online and just grabbed kind of random pictures from that show and put them on. And the only reason for that is that I was trying to say, here's how this game could handle a pre-existing story, a pre-existing something else.
Okay.
So I don't know if that is a general thing or not, but that's what I had decided to do. It also meant that I couldn't post pictures of my prototype online. Lots of designers like to do that to kind of build up interest. I felt like because I had this intellectual property involved, it wasn't right for me to say, hey, look at this card and look how great it is.
Right.
So it was limiting, but it was also a neat source of inspiration.
But so it was more than just like a black and white card with character name and abilities.
Yeah. So what I was trying to do is something clean and simple. So card name at the top, a little box where I could slap my picture in, and then a text box below. And any icons that were included were free icons that I could snag from online.
How was the lawyer process? How was the legal paperwork? Because I mean, I assume at some point somebody says we're interested, this is what we want to do. And then you're like, were you like, yeah, that everything's great? Or then the real, then the signing of the documentation happens. Like, you're like, I'm excited somebody likes me. Now we have to get married. And now here's the legal piece of it. Right. Here's the real brass tacks. Like, how did that kind of suss out, like that piece of negotiation? Did you have legal representation, or were they like, you should just do this and trust me?
No, that's a really good question. And that's an incredibly important piece of this, that ultimately there is going to be a contract. And the more specific that contract will be, I think the happier the publisher and the designer will be. You don't want to start a business relationship where everything is fuzzy. You want clearly delineated responsibilities and things like that. There are some really good resources online for what a typical contract looks like, because I had no idea what was fair to expect or to demand or to ask for, or what the industry standard was. I ended up kind of closely going through a contract process with two different companies. There were a couple of companies that were interested in this game. And as I was kind of deciding between them, kind of looking at their contracts, it was really helpful to turn to experienced designers and say, what's typical in this industry? For instance,
that is kind of the question. Yeah. What is typical? Like, what is an expectation that maybe you had that was like, nope, people are like, nope, that just doesn't happen?
I think actually my expectations were very low because I wasn't coming in thinking of this as a business. I was thinking about it as I just put something together. And yes, I put a lot of time into this, but I almost didn't think it was ever going to go anywhere. That I just enjoyed the creative process. That's probably not the correct, that's what leads to getting paid in exposure.
Yeah.
But this is not my profession, right? This was a hobby that has turned into a jobby, and I never really thought that was going to happen. But as an example, most companies are simply licensing your rules, like your game, from you. You still own the rights to the game, and they will usually revert back to you at a certain point. As in, if the publisher hasn't put anything out for 5 years or some amount of time, those rights revert back to you. Every company is going to be different. Some companies do just straight out buy the game from you and say, now it's our game, but we paid you a lot of money or more money for the rights to just buy this game from you. But usually, and this was really surprising to me, you are effectively licensing out your game system, and at some point the rights revert back to you.
So that you could then take another IP and make that story happen.
Yeah, I don't think there's a lot of examples of that, partially because the game industry moves so quickly that 5-6 years from now, a lot of the games coming out today are going to feel outdated. But there is that possibility. And I think there have been a couple of examples of that. I can't think of one off the top of my head of game comes out, there's a long time delay, it switches publishers, it comes out again.
Yeah, or things that we don't know about because it's obviously masked with different IP.
Or you think about Lords of Vegas, for instance. They got their rights back and then redid a Kickstarter to launch that and a new expansion.
Oh, that's an awesome example.
Yeah.
And an awesome game.
That somebody wants to play all of the time.
I don't own it. The only time I get to play it is at like Jill's house for his birthday, for Ezra's birthday.
Yeah. All right, so you've signed the contract. You guys are now hitched.
So then you had to consume the librarians.
So I actually chose to do that before I signed the contract.
Okay.
So some game companies just want to take your game and then say, hey, we've got in-house development people. We'll take it the last 10%, which of course is always going to take the same amount of time as the first 90%.
Right.
Yeah.
For this situation, I wanted to learn more about the game industry. I wanted to be involved. So one of the companies that I ended up saying no thank you to was a company that just said, we're going to take it from you and we're going to handle it and you can move on to other projects. And I was like, but I'm not ready to move on. I still want to work with this. So Everything Epic wanted me to take the game and rebuild it from the ground up. And I wanted to know, was I going to like this property enough to do that and do it well? So I went through and consumed all 4 seasons of the television show and all 3 movies before I signed the contract.
Okay. Did any of your mechanics change based on what the characters are or based on what the movie or, what the television show is like? Did you ever then just say, okay, I'm going to start now taking these stickers off of the dice and taking these stickers off of the cards and adding, Noah Wiley's face to something and Jane Curtin and what's the old John Larroquette cat? You know what I mean? Those guys again, too. I've watched Librarians before I knew you were making a game. So. But what changed after you started applying those items to it?
It's a mixture of both. So there are some things that I think are fundamental to like the game system that remained the same, right? That was why the game got picked up, is because of some of these fundamental mechanics. All the window dressing changed. So for instance, there's almost no cards that just got copied over into the librarian's world. So how all the cards interact with each other, the thematic and mechanical connections between those are all new. But the core underlying, like, how do you resolve an attribute check?
Got it.
How does the game handle your resources and the resource economy? That is almost unchanged. Few little minor tweaks to adapt it better to the license.
Mm-hmm. So in that process, did you kind of was it more a reiteration, or was it almost like a relearning in some respects? You know,
it's kind of like going down to the foundation and rebuilding the whole house. That you're keeping that slab foundation that got laid down before, because that is all still good, but the whole house is being taken down to the foundation and rebuilt. I think is really the analogy I would give.
Okay.
So after watching all of those shows, after designing this game,
3 weeks later, after watching all the TV,
2 questions. Who's your favorite character on the show, and who's your favorite character in the game?
Jenkins, who is played by John Larroquette, is without a doubt my favorite character from the television show. He is a scientist at heart, and he is trying to figure out how magic is ultimately just a currently unknown form of science, and that speaks to me as a scientist. And really, John Larroquette can do nothing wrong.
Yeah, I was about to say, like, I was watching an episode the other night, and because now they're like in rerun everywhere, and so John Larroquette, like, I forgot, Rebecca Romaine Stamos was just working through a problem and talking, and he's like, that's all he did. And I was like, yeah, he didn't even have to say anything. I was like, end scene. Thanks, John Larroquette.
Yep. And I think he does a really good job of playing a character who has many years of experience. I don't want to give away any spoilers from the show, but it's a character with a lot of both life experience and just knowledge. And I think it comes through really well. I think, in a role-playing game, it's always hard to play a character who's smarter than you or has experienced things that you haven't experienced. And I mean, John Larroquette's a fantastic actor, so he nails it.
Yeah. I was about to say, we were watching Lovecraft Country the other day, and I'm like, I can tell that this character has no idea about astrology. Like, you can tell the woman is just saying the words, in the script. So so to follow up on Thomas's question, besides your favorite character, now
that's an important thing.
What is your favorite artifact that has gone missing?
But actually, that brings up a good question. Everything, like, how much did you pull from the show and the feeling? How much did you have to say, okay, this is going to be a little bit different and not true? Like, how much are fans going to be like, I completely get this, and I'm in the game, and I'm in the movie, and I'm in the TV show, versus, oh, this is a little bit different because it has to fit the game mechanic?
Yeah, I think there's 3 major things you're weighing in a game like this. The first is, how true to the episode are you being? Because if you're truly faithful to it, you'll go like scene by scene, and you'll play through each scene, and each scene has to resolve exactly the way it resolved in the TV series. The second thing is like, how much of a game is going to be, right? A game has to be open to new things happening.
Yep.
In the show they went left, and now you're going to go right. There has to be new ways to address the big problem. And then the third thing you're weighing is, how is somebody who's never encountered the IP going to respond to this? Because you want it to be interesting to somebody who isn't a fan of the Librarians, right? Obviously, fans are going to be more interested, but you want it to play well regardless. And that's really hard to balance. So what I think is the most important is the gameplay of saying these stories, that the basic problem comes directly from the TV show. So for instance, early in season 1, the characters get sucked into a recreation of the labyrinth from Greek mythology. Well, in the game, there's something similar. You get sucked into a labyrinth. But the way that you navigate through that is it will feel really familiar to fans, but is not like a beat by beat recreation of the show. That really, it has to be its own game to present you with ways of solving that problem that were never thought of by the characters in the show. And you have to be okay with characters who weren't present suddenly showing up. Like maybe you want to bring in Flynn from the movies, or maybe Nicole, who's Flynn's guardian in the first movie, who isn't even present in the TV show until season 4. Maybe she just shows up because somebody wants to play her. And so you have to have a game that's flexible enough to allow for those alternate histories.
So you're coming into the final stages now, since your Kickstarter is going to launch. There's actually a lot of questions here. So again, you've kind of basically remade the game, and this time it's final artwork, you have the IP, et cetera, et cetera. What are sort of the things that happen in this last month that you're just like, okay, what would somebody expect? Because you're like, okay, game's done, now what? Like, what happens in the now what? And also, is the game actually really done? Like, are there physical boxes ready to go right now? Like, or is it just kind of, that's not the process?
Well, so the idea with Kickstarters is, and what Kickstarter as a company says, is that the product should not be finished before the campaign begins. Obviously, there have been some examples of that, but on Kickstarter's website, they say that is not the purpose of Kickstarter. It's to generate funds to create something.
Yep.
But I will say that the game is in a place where we're comfortable publishing it now.
Okay.
Like, as in, once we generate funds, it should be able to be printed at that point. So we already have and I shouldn't say we, I should say the publisher, right? Everything Epic. So not including myself, because as a designer, I'm really not intimately involved in setting up the Kickstarter page, doing the marketing, reaching out to companies to actually print it. All of those things I would do if I was self-publishing. And the whole reason I'm going with a publisher is to not do those things.
Yeah.
So I am tangentially involved at best with all of these really, really important elements. And that's why you have a team of people working on it. But so as far as what's happening right now, a lot of what's happening is people, not me, are frantically doing last minute preparations. Whereas I'm continuing to make sure that the game is as balanced as possible. It's weird, these things from your childhood that stick with you. I think when DVDs were first getting extended features, there was like an interview, I don't even remember which DVD it was, where the director was saying, movies are never finished, they're just abandoned. As in, you could always make it better. Always do more on it, but at some point you just have to release it. And I feel like that's true of every creative endeavor, including games. Like, even now I'm tweaking numbers up by one or down by one to try and get the balance tighter and tighter. One of my goals is to make it
is so the publisher like, we're going to print, stop it?
So at this point, I've been told, I have delivered the final text of cards, but it could be that a couple of cards will still be changed even at this late stage. But my goal is to make every game feel close, that win or lose, if you lose, you feel like you were almost there, and if you win, you feel like you just scooted across the finish line before all hell broke loose. And so finding that balance for myself, who's played the game more than any other human, and for a new player, is a really interesting experience.
Nice. Did you get any when they were like designing stuff? Did they send you, hey, this is what this card is going to look like? What do you think? Or are they just handling all of that?
So yes, I got kind of proofs of like, here's what the card frame would look like. And I would say that I had some input on that. It's one of the weird things about publishing with a publisher, is that you go from a game that you like gave birth to, right? You were the sole creative force behind this, and now you're part of a team that's working on it. So I had some ability to have input, but ultimately not decision-making power on how the cards are going to look, things like that.
So it was your responsibility there then just to make sure that everything on the card was still true to the game itself. So basically you were proofing it for mechanics reasons, like if, you know, how it reads, you know, because that's something that I do find is that I read things over and over and I'm like, it has a comma. Does that change the meaning? Like literally we were doing that with Gloomhaven yesterday. And I'm just like, what does that comma mean? Do I have to do this first in order to like, yeah, you just go down that rabbit hole of what does that comma mean?
Well, and particularly with a card game, because every card now gives you new text.
Yep.
And I think it's one of the reasons card game can be intimidating the first time you play it, because you just finished reading the rule book, and that was a monster, right?
Mm-hmm.
Nobody likes rule books, even if they're well crafted. And now you draw a hand of cards, and you're like, oh God, I have to read more text. Like, really? I can't just play the game yet? I have to read what these cards do? And so, yeah, that's really important, trying to make it concise and understandable and as unambiguous as possible. What I find is that there's always going to be someone to interpret things in a bizarre way that you never thought was going to be possible. But trying to make it as unambiguous as you can for a general audience.
Do you have any other follow-up questions?
I mean, I have 100 follow-up questions, like who's on the team? How big is the team? Like, how big is the publisher? Would you get a bigger team if you had a different publisher? Like, I could just go on forever.
So I think, I mean, just looking at their Facebook page now, for everything Epic, the Librarians is their header, but they are promoting Rambo right now. Do you know anything about Rambo? The game.
So I know a little bit about it, but I don't have any insider information on it.
Yeah.
So that was a Kickstarter that finished 2 years ago, year and a half ago, and they're finally getting it into the hands of backers. So there were some unfortunate delays on that. Some of them being internal things, and some of them being making sure that the licensor was okay with everything. The weird thing about working with an intellectual property is that the license holder ultimately can thumbs up or thumbs down things for any reason at any time. So you can be like, well, you were okay with this the last 3 times. Why are you now saying you're not okay with this? Yeah. So I have no idea what the actual story was, but after some delays, Rambo is now in people's homes.
Okay. And then, that's a long time frame from Kickstarter to
fulfillment.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the goal is to shorten that for librarians. So I think for Rambo, some Kickstarters, the game is 80% done when it goes to Kickstarter, and then you get these updates about, oh, we're still playtesting the game, or we promised you all these stretch goals, but they hadn't been designed, and we're in the design process. Personally, that drives me insane. So here, the stretch goals are all designed. They've all gone through the same rigorous playtesting process as every other piece of it. So, and we've been working with the license holder for librarians. They're called Electric Entertainment. The whole way, they've been really great to work with, and very overall pretty clear on what they want. I think once again, it's the ambiguity that drives you crazy. And leads to delays. So they've been a really good partner. Once again, I haven't directly worked with them, but at least going through an intermediate, it seems like they've been really great to work with. So we're hoping that this is going to be a really quick turnaround once the Kickstarter funds kind of a final read through of everything by a person who's never seen the game before. We blind play tested it a couple of times where someone learns it just from the rules, but we want a professional editor to go through and do one final loving pass on everything and then print.
And you wrote the rule book?
Yes. So I wrote the rule book. It's been edited by others, which should be comforting to everybody, because once again, I'm an academic and I can't write anything succinctly to save my life. So yes, the rule book actually existed before it became the Librarians game, and has obviously gone through a lot of revisions since.
Nice.
Okay. Yeah. So I think that's, I mean, definitely interesting, definitely in depth. Thank you for sharing that experience because, yeah, I mean, in total, how many years?
Right around 4.
Okay. That's what I was thinking.
Yeah.
So
So,
close to
about
5,
2
which is
years
amazing.
to kind of get the system working the way I wanted. And then it's been about 2 years since the Librarians license. You know, we signed the contract and brought the Librarians license on board. And honestly, I don't know how long that is compared to most games. One of the things I think is true about this style of game is every time you tell a new story, it's almost like a new game. Like you have to rebalance a totally new scenario. And so I'm guessing that these style of games take a lot longer to balance than a Euro game, you know, where every playthrough is the same except for what the players do.
So what is the one sort of takeaway advice you would give to somebody who is thinking of designing a game? Like I am. Like I'm thinking I would like to design a game.
I'm thinking, sure, whatever. Good luck to you, sir.
Well, so one piece of advice.
That's what I was saying. When he said one piece, I was like, my God, to me, just listening to this, like my takeaways a lot of times are just
what is the start? Where do you start?
Okay, let's start with that.
Yeah, so I think the starting point is 2 places at once, depending on how much time you have. The most important thing is start educating yourself about how people design games. There's a lot of game design groups on Facebook and other places. Honestly, there's a lot of local game design meetups. Even in the middle of nowhere, Nebraska, there is a game designer meetup that happens. So there are communities to plug into. And then the second thing is just get started and don't keep it all in your head, because we can convince ourselves that the dumbest ideas are perfect. And that is just our nature as humans, right? This game's going to work out great. It's going to be beautiful. I can't believe how these mechanics are going to interweave, and then it all falls apart on the table. So get it onto the table as quickly as possible and educate yourself.
Yep, and torture your family.
Sounds good. You're going to have to play that game over and over and over.
Nope.
I can find it to 2 pieces of advice. Hopefully that's short enough.
Nice. Cool. So thank you, Brett, for taking the time to talk to us. We're really looking forward to the Kickstarter, which is supposedly launching very soon.
Actually, we're looking more forward to the fulfillment.
Well, yeah, but
I mean, Kickstarter, but
one thing at a time.
Yeah, step 1 first.
You have to first back it, and then you get it. Then you get it. So.
Well, thank you so much for your time. It's been really delightful to come and both reconnect with you and also to get to talk about the creative process.
Cool. Thank you.
So we appreciate it. Thanks.
Are you going to wrap up the segment or no?
Thanks,
audience. Bye.
Yeah, that's going to wrap up our interview with Brett Schofield, designer of the Librarians. Is that how we end it?
Sure. Sounds good to me.
Okay. Now you want to wrap up the episode?
Nope. That's it. Done.
That's it. Okay. Goodbye,
Thanks, everybody.